all, I'd like to talk about what makes Sangam literature special. Sanskrit literature was first used for religico-magical purposes. The Indo-Aryans seem to have entered India around 2000 BCE. And they entered the Punjab, and then the language and the culture, which was influenced by the native culture there, because the Indus Valley had been there, and the Indus Valley may even have been Dravidian speaking, they spread all over India. Now, the oldest things that we have in this language of these Indo-Aryans, which we call Sanskrit or Vedic Sanskrit, were magical chants. The magical chants were meant to change the world, to influence how the world worked, and to make the people who recited them prosperous and victorious in battle. Here's an example. It's one from the Rig Veda, and it's a hymn to Indra, basically asking him to help the people who recited it, the tribe, the Indo-Aryan tribe, to be victorious. Let me read it here. If you see what it says, it's not talking about the real world. It's talking about a mythical time when Indra killed the demon Twashter. Indrasya nuviryani pravocham yani chakara prathamani vajri ahannahim manvapastatarda pravakshana abhinat parvatanam, and so on. Now I will speak of Indra's strong acts that he did at the beginning of time, he who holds the thunder. He killed the snake, he let the waters loose, he split apart the bellies of mountains, and so on. Now, what you have to notice here is this is not the real world it's talking about. It's a fantasy world in which Indra did something wonderful, and that if these people can make Indra happy, Indra will come and make them prevail in battle. It's not about everyday life. So what do we see in Sanskrit? Now, I'm not trying to denigrate Sanskrit. The Rig Veda has some beautiful passages in it, but simply to point out a difference in perspective and that kind of thing. So as a result, Sanskrit literature tended to be about mythological or mythic subjects. It was the people in Sanskrit literature are anonymous. In terms, what I mean by anonymous is you can't identify them with real people. We don't know, there are no references to real people such as we have in Greek and Roman literature and in Sangam literature. Ordinary people are not, for the most part, described. It's all this beautiful mythical reality where everything is somehow perfect, and it can be very, very charming and very beautiful, but it's not about the lives we all really lead. It was the literature, the languages that people actually spoke in North India, we have very little in them except for Buddhist things in Pali and then some things in Prakrit in Sanskrit plays. So we don't have literature that people really spoke, from what languages people really spoke. Sanskrita, Sanskrit, means artificial. It means perfected. It means artificial. It's not the language of everyday people. Finally, the sources, the people who wrote in Sanskrit were mostly people in Brahminical cultures, or in a Brahminical culture, and I would say the great majority were Brahmins. So you did not get a sense in Sanskrit of ordinary everyday people. It should be pointed out that Sanskrit later became the lingua franca, the cosmopolitan language of half of the world. And at that point, there were huge numbers of things, of Buddhist tracts also written in Sanskrit. But still, when we talk about how it developed, we don't see the ordinary people appearing. Now let's go to early Tamil. The old Tamil anthologies, the Sangam anthologies, which we can maybe date to the 1st or the 3rd century of the Common Era, they did not have any religious, they didn't have any religious purpose or magical purpose. They were about ordinary people. They came from village life, from folk literature, and they were written by, or they were composed by literate people who wrote very sophisticated pieces, but in them we see village life and village things and ordinary things and human suffering and human happiness all reflected. The poems, when the poems talk about people, they're not anonymous. Sometimes they are. The Taliva and Talivi are anonymous. They could, but they always, almost always, especially the longer poems, the Aham poems and the Puram poems also, refer to real people, things that really happened. This sets it way apart from Sanskrit literature, where everything is a myth. Now, another thing about this extraordinary old literature is that taking its origin among ordinary people and their sufferings and their joys and all of the things that go into a normal life, somehow or other, and perhaps this was partly the influence of Buddhists or Jains or Ajivikas who came into the area, or we don't really know. And it also was simply something which developed organically out of the culture that was there. But a whole ethical view of the world arose. And this ethical view of the world, as Dr. Prabhakaran pointed out yesterday, is not premised upon any religion, any notion of God. It's premised upon ordinary life and how people should act. One of the great poems is the one everyone knows, Yado More Avaram Kerir. Incidentally, there's a Sanskrit version of this, Ayam nijah parova veti ganana lagucheta mudara charitanam tu vasadhaiva kutumbakam, which means pretty much what this says. For those who have noble conduct, the whole world is their family. And what's funny about that is it comes from the Hitopadesha, where the fox is trying to pull the wool over, I forget exactly which, but some other creature's eyes, and he's saying this to try to trick him. Whereas in Tamil, when we see this, it doesn't have that context. So let's just read this poem. And what I'd like to do here is point out not the beginning, which everyone knows and everyone has seen a million times, but the whole poem. Every city is your city, everyone is your kin. Failure and prosperity do not come to you because others have sent them, nor do suffering and the end of suffering. There is nothing new in death. Thinking that living is sweet, we do not rejoice in it. Even less do we say, if something unwanted happens, that to live is miserable. Through the vision of those who have understood, we know that a life with its hardship makes its way like a raft, riding the water of a huge and powerful river, roaring without pause as it breaks against rocks because the clouds, crowded with bolts of lightning, pour down their cold drops of rain. And so we are not amazed at those who are great, and even less do we despise the weak. What an extraordinary motto for humanism this poem is. I don't think you could find anything in any literature which sums up humanistic ideals more perfectly. When you read it in Tamil, the poem flows with a kind of, you can feel the river roaring on the rocks, and it's just a magnificent poem. Yadumure yavarum kelir thidum nandrum pirtaravara nodalum tanidalum avatroranna sadalum puduvadandre vardal yinidana mahindandrum ilame munivin yennadendralum ilame மின்னொடுவானம் தன்துடி தலையானாது களம் பொருது இறங்கும் மல்லல் பேர்யாற்று நீர்வழி படும் புனைபோல் ஆருயிர் முறைவழி படும் என்பது திரவோர் காட்சியின் தெளிந்தனமாகலின் மாட்சியின் பெரியோரை வியத்தலும் இளமே சிறியோரை இகழ்தல் அதனினும் இளமே. Did I leave out a line? Well, that's all right. Now, let me go. I want to come to a poem which this kind of thing is very rare. It's certainly not found, as far as I know, in Sanskrit anywhere I know. This is a poem by Seraman Kottambalat Tunjir Makode. He's a king, obviously, a Chera king, and he's lost his wife. And in this poem, he simply describes how overcome he is with grief because his wife has died. It's a very moving poem, and it shows you how in this literature there's a confrontation with death and suffering which is very realistic. This is what he says. Though it is so immense, does my grief nonetheless have its limits, since it is not fierce enough to finish with my life? On the salty earth, all overgrown with sedge, on the burning ground, my wife has gone her way to the other world, her bed, the shining fire of the pyre whose wood yields its glow of blazing fuel, and I am still alive? What kind of place is this world? And this is something everyone who has encountered death of someone they love must feel. Let me move on. We come to another one of the great and very famous and well-known ethical poems. Yesterday we were talking about it. Dr. Prabhakaran mentioned that the world exists because of good people, and that's what this poem says. This world exists because men exist, and you might say men and women. Actually, the Tamil could be man, male, or woman, but in English we have to use men usually for poetic reasons. This world exists because men exist who, even if they were to win the divine drink of the gods, would not drink it by themselves, only thinking of its sweetness, Men without hate, without slackness in action, though they may have fears like the fears of other men, who would even give their lives for fame, but would not accept fame with dishonor were it to gain them all the world. Men who have no regrets, and with virtues so exalted, never exert their powerful energies for themselves, but only for others. It is because they exist that we do. One wonders about the poet Kadarol Mind the Yiramperuvarudi. He was a Pandyan, perhaps a prince. He somewhere disappeared in the ocean, perhaps in a battle or something. Anyway, in Tamil the poem is very, very beautiful. Undalamma yivulaham yindirar amridam yaivadayinum yinidana tamiyar undalumillare munivilar துஞ்சலுமிலர் பிறர் அஞ்சுவதும் அஞ்சி புகழெனின் உயிரும் கொடுக்குவர் பழியனின் உலகுடன் பெரினும் கொள்ளலர் அயர்விலர் அன்னமாட்சி அனையராகி தமக்கென முயலா நோந்தாள் பிறர்க்கென முயலுனர் உண்மையானே. And if you want to talk about poetry, you can see how it's all short sentences, and then when you get to the great summation, at the end, it all starts rolling out. And these poems are among the finest poems you can find anywhere. You won't find many poems of this caliber. Now, I'm going to just end with, since we were talking about God, and does God exist or not, there's one rather, it's a rather chilling poem, but it talks about the world and about whether God exists. It starts out by talking about how human life is different, about how it's full of joy and grief. So it starts out, in one house the funeral drum rattles. In one house the wedding music of a concert drum booms out pleasure. Women who have their men with them don ornaments of flowers. Women whose men have gone off pour down their falling tears. Surely a God who has no virtues is the creator of this world which is so filled with pain. May those who comprehend its nature see their way to bliss. In other words, well, let's look at the Tamil. Oril nedal karanga Oril indan muravin pani tadumba Punardor puvani aniya Pirindor paidal unkan panivarbu uraipa Padaiton mandra appan bilalan Yenadamma yevulaham Yeniya kanga idaniyal bunarndore. Now, if you look at this, what did we say? God who has no virtues. Well, if you look at the Tamil, it's a little more than that. What does he say? He says, let's see, Padaiton mandra appanbilalan. He has no panbu. Panbu, he's not decent. There's something indecent about this creator God who made all of this world to be so filled with grief and joy, and you can't depend on anything. So anyway, to sum up, this early literature of Tamil, so-called Sangam literature, and I could give a similar talk on the Ahananura, which is just an unimaginably profound and magnificent work. Everybody reads Ahananura and they say, oh God, another Pali poem, another Kurinji poem. But then when you start looking at the poems, they're all different. And each one has something extraordinary and moving to say about the world. And of course, the Purananura is surely one of the great statements of human life in any literature. There's nothing like the Purananura or the Ahananura in Sanskrit. Nothing whatsoever. Sanskrit is a rarefied language. It can be very beautiful. I'm not putting it down or saying it's a bad language, but it doesn't have this connection with the earth and with everyday life. The person who really brought it to the attention of the world was A.K. Ramanujan, who grew up speaking mainly Kannada. His family spoke Tamil, and of course he knew English well. He was mainly a Kannada writer and an English writer, but when he discovered Sangam literature, he was simply enthralled. He never liked Sanskrit very much. It was too artificial for him. But Sangam literature drew him in and really started what he did in the second half of his life. He was also, incidentally, a Shakespearean scholar, so he brought that to it. And his translations of Sangam literature opened up a whole new window into ancient India, which before had been seen only through Sanskrit. So to sum up what these poems say, they say, suffering and pain will always exist. Wisdom is to live with generosity and restraint, helping others, always mindful that if we are fortunate, ultimately we are the same as those who are less favored by fate than we are. And that is a very profound and, I would argue, completely humanistic message that somehow these poems 2,000 years ago managed to find and pass on to us. Thank you very much.